everybody.
Turn this up in my headphones, Charles.
Turning it up. Hello, everybody, one and all. Welcome to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. My name is Charles, and with me today, as always, is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend, Charles.
I am ready to talk some fantasy with my friend as well, Dylan, but not just any fantasy today, because today we are finally getting around to the books that we had selected back when we did Friends Pitching Fantasy, which feels like a lifetime ago. And, you know, the fans voted. They had a choice between A Wizard of Earthsea and All Systems Red. And people wanted to hear A Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin first. And that is what we are here to discuss today.
Yeah, I'm really pumped to get into this. So we will be getting to All Systems Red, in a week?
Yep.
Charles?
Yeah.
Awesome. And Fiction Fans podcast will be coming on,
which
we are super excited about.
Yep.
But for now, we're here to talk about A Wizard of Earthsea. And if you have not yet read A Wizard of Earthsea, this episode will have spoilers for that book in it, so now is a good time to turn this down in your headphones if you don't want to get that book spoiled for you, and pick that classic book up if you want to give it a read.
Yes, very well said, Dylan. It's a really fun read, and I'm super excited to get into it. But at the top of the episode, I did want to contextualize this book's place in history just super quickly. It was published in 1968.
Yes.
Which, if you think about it, Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, was published in 1954. So these are super early works of what I would consider modern fantasy.
Yeah. And when you think about how long ago that was, that's 53 years ago. So that's a long time, and I think this is probably the second oldest book that we've read on the podcast. I can't imagine what would be. I mean, Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, Lord of the Rings is the oldest, and I think this would be the second oldest.
Yeah, I don't think anything probably even comes close.
No, it's like the 90s, right. I think, is next.
Right,
like Wheel of Time, yeah. So it's a big gap between these two books. So yeah, this feels like it's another generation before Wheel of Time, which is something
it is.
Yeah, it is, and it's interesting to consider as we go through it, because it feels like this could have been written today. It's so vibrant.
In a lot of ways, it feels like it could be written today. In a lot of ways, it doesn't. And normally that doesn't would not be a compliment coming from me, as I've kind of got this like more modern fantasy fan spin to me. But I would say that when compared to a lot of the more recent works that we've read, the things that made A Wizard of Earthsea different were like a breath of fresh air for me.
Yeah.
Because it was so different a style of storytelling than anything that I've read in fantasy, really, that I can even think of. It's like this, I think it was our buddy David S., who's at Book Meanderings on Twitter. It's awesome. Yeah, awesome, dude. And I think he said it had like this campfire style, campfire story style telling to it. Sorry if I'm misquoting and that was someone else, but that's my memory of it, was David S. And yeah, that I went in like aware of, because he said that before we started reading. I was like, that's exactly what this is. It's like sitting down next to Ursula K. Le Guin with all of her wisdom and having her just tell me and the other folks around the campfire, I like to think you were there too, Charles, and just tell us this incredible story full of evocative themes and morals and just wisdom is the word that comes up most for me. Just so much wisdom packed into such a small book. It was absolutely incredible, Charles. And I'm not typically the person who gravitates toward books written over 50 years ago, but this was amazing.
I'm glad to hear that. And when I pitched it, I was very calculated in comparing it to Name of the Wind for that reason, that priority on this idea of storytelling, whereas Patrick Rothfuss is kind of exploring the art of telling stories through his characters. Ursula K. Le Guin is actually telling a story in the storytelling kind of way, and their prose ends up having a lot of similarities, and it's this storytelling, artistic kind of prose that really pulls you in. And I'm glad to hear that you liked it. And a part of the reason why I thought you would was just because of how close to the vest you have Kingkiller play to you. So that's one of the reasons that I recommended it in the first place.
Charles, for so many reasons, I was thinking about the Kingkiller Chronicle when I was reading this series. Not just the Magic School, and we won't spoil the Kingkiller Chronicle during this.
Right.
But there's magical school elements to it, which are also elements of the Kingkiller Chronicle. And I think that one of the most interesting differences to the way that the stories are told, despite it both being this storytelling, is that it feels like in A Wizard of Earthsea, we have, like I said, Ursula K. Le Guin and all of her wisdom telling us a story about Ged. And then in the Kingkiller Chronicle, we have Quoth or Coat telling his own story and the ways in which Ursula is able to see Ged's naivety and tell us, the reader, like, here's the way in which Ged had folly in this moment. Coat telling his own story in the Kingkiller Chronicle, he's still stuck to his own perspective, and he isn't always. Sometimes he's able to point out where he went awry, but he's still biased in this "I'm the hero of my own story" way.
Right.
So it's interesting. I just feel I haven't ever heard Patrick Rothfuss talk about his influences really, but how could it not? It feels like it have involved A Wizard of Earthsea, because I just saw so many parallels, and there's these moments too in a Kingkiller Chronicle where other characters are telling stories that almost feel like A Wizard of Earthsea wrapped into the Kingkiller Chronicle in its own ways. And yes, that prose, Charles. So good.
I know. There's so many fantastic quotes in Wizard of Earthsea that I'm super excited to get into. The other background information that I thought was super interesting was basically in the 60s. A publisher was like, hey, Ursula, there's this writing for teenagers is all the rage. How about you write us one of these books here? And she was like, okay, I never thought of like how to write for teenagers. And her approach to writing the story was super calculated from the beginning. And my version of A Wizard of Earthsea had this kind of notes from the author at the end, and she gets into exactly all the calculated moves that she put behind the purpose of this novel. And there's a couple subversion things that she definitely wanted to do, which we can get into later. They're super interesting, but the main one being was, okay, well, it's a book for teenagers, but I'm going to write it to be read by anyone. And that is kind of a breakthrough, honestly, where it's like, hey, just because it's YA doesn't mean it's exclusively written
YA wasn't even really.
Exactly. Like, this was what it was like.
Yet.
I know, this was like the beginning. There was like, I think she said a novel for teenagers. They hadn't quite named the genre yet, but she was like, well, I'll write it for teenagers, but I'll write it in a way where it can be read and appreciated by anyone. Teenagers are adults too, and are going through the same stuff that we've all gone through in our...
Well, they're people too.
Yeah, and they're people too.
By nature, teenagers are not adults.
And she actually says that, I think, at some point. And one of the lines was like...
Teenagers are adults too.
Yeah, or people too, or something like that.
Oh, yeah.
It was something that
I think she does.
She was kind of alluding to, and you think that that's obvious, but it's kind of a breakthrough for this book, and I think that's what put this book over the over the top and has held its place in like must-read fantasy for so long is this idea of, well, Merlin and Gandalf must have been young, right? When they were kids, how'd they learn to be wizards? And what does it mean to learn to be a wizard? And she says, I knew where he, meaning our main character Ged, was going, where he had to go, not only to learn to be a wizard, but to learn to be Ged. And that's the distinction that like takes this book like into the S tier of like all these kind of fantasy themes, right? It's like not just learning to be a wizard, but learning to be himself. And I was like, oh, Dylan's gonna be all over that as a psychology student.
Yes, yeah, I was definitely all over that. I mean, there's a lot of things, not just those identity pieces that I definitely gravitated toward, but pieces about like dealing with trauma was another thing that came up for me. And this isn't one that I see, like it wasn't on the Wikipedia page or anything like that. So it might have been, like I'm a grad student in psychology, so that's kind of my auto filter that I see things through. Not necessarily trauma, although sometimes, but like like what's the psychological interpretation,
like the psychology
of
lens
this?
of this event. Yeah.
So I think, the whole of the crux of this story, right, revolves around this idea of Ged summons this shadow at one point. It ends up killing one of his mentors, and I gotta find that. It's something with an N, right?
Yeah. So he ends up killing the archmage at the time. So, and his name is Nemerle, Nemmerle, Nemerle.
Nemerle?
Yes.
So, all right. Then, so he ends up in a roundabout way getting Nemerle killed because Nemerle has to sacrifice himself in order to
he like expends all his energy to
Ged,
banish the shadow. Basically.
Yes. Well, I guess because the shadow's still around, it's more like to prevent the shadow from killing Ged. It seems like overtaking him completely. And then it's Ged running away from this darker shadow. And I guess a lot of the way that Ursula K. Le Guin was thinking about it and people have interpreted it as this shadow is like the dark side of Ged, and the fact that we all have the capability for evil and our acts can produce evil, and right, it's this like power, like the Spider-Man thing, right?
Yeah,
with great power
yeah.
comes great responsibility, and we have to learn that any act could be evil or could be good, and we have to figure out which one is going to be before we decide. And it feels like that's like the main way that people tend to interpret this. I was seeing that too. I guess a lot of the way I was thinking about was like from this perspective of trauma, where Ged is having to like deal with the shadow of having killed one of his mentors and carrying that around with him everywhere, and he's running from it so much. But then I'm in counseling psych, so one of the pretty much the way that it's empirically supported, or like the research supports how one deals with trauma in a therapeutic setting, is through these treatments that involve facing and or making sense of the traumatic event. And it's only really when Ged is able to like turn around and face the shadow and like accept that it's part of him and his experience, that he's able to overcome all of these things that have tortured him for so long. And I thought like that's a thing that was spinning through my head a lot, like that and stuff about death that maybe we can get into.
No, I really appreciate your perspective on that, because I think it's absolutely true. And one of the things that I love about this book that we don't get a lot of in fiction and in fantasy in particular is that, there's connotations to things being bad, but they're not necessarily evil all of the time, right? You have this kind of yin and yang, and they coexist. It's not like you just only have good and you try to avoid evil and bad things as much as possible. It's a balance. And for me, what I loved about the story is that all the evil in this book is basically a misunderstanding of like what this evil is, or what the balance, or like what Ged understands from himself, right? The shadow isn't, it does bad things, but it's not inherently evil. He embraces it and it becomes a part of himself. It's because he didn't understand the shadow and he didn't confront the shadow that it was
Right.
able to fester and do all these things. But it's like you said, it's when you pursue it head on and you embrace it
Yeah.
and you acknowledge it as part of yourself that you're able to exist with it. So this
Yeah.
idea of like, just because something is bad doesn't mean it's not a part of you, and it doesn't coexist with the good things as well. So those themes ring so honest and true in this story, and I don't know if I've read a story quite like it, where it takes that very calculated, people call it these Taoist themes about balance and equilibrium of good and evil, but to me it's just this idea of like, hey, we have these parts of ourselves that are confusing, that we're scared of, or maybe they're
Yeah.
traumatic, and that makes us part of who we are. It's our identity. It's not something we need to block off, avoid, run away from, like personify it as something evil that's separate from yourself, and those themes are like through this idea of a shadow. It's brilliant.
Yeah, for sure. There's a quote, one of the ones I highlighted, that is, "What one does not know, one fears." And it's very simply stated, but this idea of uh, be, be it trying to uh, actually wrestle with and deal with the emotions that one is facing in the aftermath of uh, trauma, and seek acceptance, like which is kind of how I was thinking about it, and how some of these like treatments in therapy would think about helping someone like accept the bad of like, this event was terrible and that's okay, because oh, like, here I am now, and I can live even though it's happened.
Hmm.
And then this idea too of just like, this could be a darker side of my identity and who I am, and I have these like negative, I mean, negative is probably not the Taoist way of thinking about it, but these sort of like uh, darker elements to who I am, and I've made mistakes and those kind of things, and like those things forget a lot of times, it seems like, our pride and the, I guess, wanting to make oneself appear stronger or more powerful, rather than just accepting like, this is where I am at right now and this is who I am. And I think acceptance for me is one of the biggest themes here.
That's really well said. One of the more obvious themes that this book is, to me, one of the shining examples of this idea of coming of age,
Yes.
and it Ursula K. Le Guin takes such a serious and like philosophical approach to coming of age through magic and through the fantastic that I've rarely read before. I mean, there's this, we get tons of these coming of age stories over and over again of, someone being born and there's some sort of chosen one that thrusts them on an adventure, they overthrow evil. Like, we get these stories so much, especially in the modern age, but like the recent
You mean
fantasy.
that word we learned, Bildungsroman? A novel,
Bildungsroman, yes.
Bildungsroman?
Which we
Yeah, a
learned
novel
from this.
a show at some point.
Yeah.
I From FTF, that is, a novel dealing with one's person's formative years or spiritual education, and
Mhm.
that word appears on a Wizard of Earthsea's Wikipedia page, and people say it around this a lot too.
Right. And to come back to this idea of like the good and evil about yourself, and also it's just the Spider-Man idea of using power responsibly. There's this quote
Right.
that I read in this in this book that I absolutely love. It might be my most favorite quote in all of Earthsea.
Wow. And that's high praise, because I don't know if I've ever highlighted my highlights per page. I mean, this might be the highest, and we've read the King Killer. I've read the King Killer Chronicle multiple times.
We do a whole thing called quotes.
Yes, so this is high praise. So let's hear one of your favorite quotes.
Here's one of my favorites.
Let's hear it.
And so Ged is meeting with one of his early masters, and don't quote me on this, but I believe it is Ogion that says this. And
he was an awesome character, by the way.
Awesome character, great teacher too, and we can get into that. But great mentor, actually. When we did that mentors episode back in the day,
he could have been in there.
He was so easily in there. And but I will read some of his advice here, which I think it's his advice. And the truth is that as a man's real power grows and his knowledge widens, ever the way he can follow grows narrower, until at last he chooses nothing, but does only and wholly what he must do.
I highlighted that too.
It's like, wow, that's a great quote. And it's this idea that, with more knowledge and more power, there's always this idea of the more you know, the less you realize that you know, like that kind of thing. But this idea of responsibility as you become older and more independent and things like this, it's there's obviously these are the right things to do, and I'm guided by doing the right thing. And it's just from growing up and maturing and recognizing some of these things where it's almost like the action is taken away from you as you understand what the right thing to do is. And I don't know, that quote just rang true for me.
Yeah, that's a great quote, Charles. And this idea of equilibrium comes up a lot in A Wizard of Earthsea, and that in a lot of ways the greatest wisdom is just to be in touch with and accepting of your nature and not try to resist or do things different or try to change things too much or anything like that. And one of the things that stuck out to me, he has that pet, I think, was it called Oaken or something like that? Do you have that anywhere, Charles?
The name of the pet? No, but it was something like it had a short, cute name. I remember that.
Yeah. So he has that pet, and it is kind of just, might as well be a dog, but it's not a dog because it's a fantasy novel here. And there's a point where Ged is almost just dead. I think it's right after the shadow situation when he first summons it. And this is one of the quotes I highlighted. Later, when Ged thought back upon that night, he knew that had none touched him when he lay thus spirit lost, had none called him back in some way, he might have been lost for good. It was only the dumb, instinctive wisdom of the beast who licks his hurt companion to comfort him. And yet, in that wisdom, Ged saw something akin to his own power, something that went as deep as wizardry. From that time forth he believed that the wise man is one who never sets himself apart from other living things, whether they have speech or not, and in later years he strove long to learn what can be learned in silence from the eyes of animals, the flight of birds, the great slow gestures of trees. And I think that quote you brought up, Charles, of Ogion.
I highlighted that too, by the way. And it's not Ogion. I'm going to correct. It's the summoner. One of the people at the school gave that advice.
Yeah, so the summoner. Bring that up. And kind of the way that Ogion lives his life, too.
Yes.
I know why you thought it was Ogion, because
Thank you.
Ogion just goes about his life as kind of this wanderer. He doesn't really ever use
He lets
magic.
Ged go because he recognizes that's the right thing to do and all those things.
It's about acceptance of it's not his life to live. I think it's here's the thing that I want is for you to stay with me and to be where I'm at right now, and I also understand that you make your own choices and that you're not there yet, so I'm going to let you go if that's what you desire, which is what dude,
if you love someone, you set them free.
You do and Charles, this going back to your quote, which was this idea of like just the wisdom of not trying to do any more than you must.
Right.
And I think that's kind of part of what's gotten at, for lack of a better way of phrasing it, by Wizard of Earthsea, where early on the things I get is doing when he's first coming into his power and he doesn't know better. Like he is very juvenile, naive, and prideful, and all these kind of things. Is he just starts taking control of these animals who are living in equilibrium
Mm-hmm.
with the world, and he like calls the hawks and stuff like that and makes them do his bidding. And it's like this idea of a hawk just going about being a hawk. There's nothing more wise in a lot of
Yeah.
ways than that. And humans almost have this curse in some ways of like not being in touch with that at a fundamental level, just like what does it mean to be a human and just go about being human. And for Ged and for many of us, it's this journey of like being stuck in our thoughts and our emotions and all these kind
No.
of things, and
Yeah.
saying, where does this all come together for me to just be a person? And it's
Yeah.
only when Ged starts to accept like I'm a person in all of what that means that he's really learned his lessons and
That's
all of this.
incredibly well said. And it brings me back to, again, we were saying that Ursula K. Le Guin was very calculated when she wrote this book. And one of the things that she mentions in the notes afterwards is there's no wars in Earthsea, no soldiers, no armies, no battles. And she's made that conscious decision to avoid those kinds of conflicts because it's going back to what you said. There's some sort of power and equilibrium in an animal just loving a human being that is almost as powerful as being a mage. And to expand on that quote that I had given from the summoner right before he says that bit about being wise means doing what's required of you, is you thought as a boy that a mage is one who can do anything. So I thought once, so did we all. This idea
Mm.
that what is power? Power doesn't mean you can do anything or that you're stronger than someone else. Power means you have this, understanding of the world. And once the more powerful you become, the more connected you are in it. And
Mm.
by removing wars and battles and from the equation in this story, you can focus more on the emotional idea of power and this individual psychology of power as well.
Yeah, that's well said, Charles. And dude, I'm in absolute awe of Ursula K. Le Guin.
I know.
I can't believe this is, Charles, you've at times dragged me kicking and screaming back into the more I guess the word is seminal works of
Right, the
fantasy.
classics.
These like classics is a much more direct way to say that. And I, at times I haven't enjoyed those as much as a lot of the more modern stuff. And I'll say this is a time where I'm like, oh, like this was clearly a bias of like the older stuff doesn't have much to offer that Ursula has made me confront in myself and learn to try to accept that shadow that I've been maybe unnecessarily biased against some of these older works, and that like Ursula's work that she put out in, it was what, 1968 you said,
Yeah.
that has so much to offer, and that she put out for teenagers basically in 1968 has so much to offer me, I feel like, as an adult in 2021.
Yeah.
It's like amazing because it's almost, in a lot of ways it feels like the story is one of not being so hasty.
Yeah, I know. And this, so much of modern fantasy is about wars and battles and politics and like seeing this kind of grim dark perception of humanity. And part of what I love about classic fantasy is that it comes back to the human condition. It's more of this epic storytelling adventure kind of way to explore the human condition, and I can't think of a better example than A Wizard of Earthsea. It's really one of those stories that hits right down to the human condition. It's such a study on coming of age and of power and of self-acceptance that only can be told through this fantastical this fantastical story, and the purpose of removing, which I mean, I love like the violence and wars and battles and sword fights and things of modern fantasy, love it completely, but the conscious effort to not have that, it services this story super super well, and I just thought it was one of those really interesting, calculated, like a better word, subversions that Ursula chose to put into Earthsea.
Yeah, I agree, Charles. It's not something I realized until I started seeing it as a thing that got brought up a lot here, and I guess it was even more revolutionary during the time that Ursula K. Le Guin was writing this, to deliberately leave out war, because we have, I guess I do think of things like the Kingkiller Chronicle and stuff like that that aren't about war so much, or anything that comes now, but it's possible that a lot of those modern works wouldn't feel free to do that if Ursula K. Le Guin didn't come in 50 plus years ago and say, like, no, you can write a, another thing that comes to mind is something like Robin Hobb's work, and we know Robin Hobb, we know from a Twitter interaction
Yeah.
with her that we
Yes.
had, that as simple as her liking a post that you wrote about a Wizard of Earthsea, we know that she really appreciates this work. And you think of someone like Robin Hobb, who writes a very like person-focused, reflective tale about a person that just so happens to be in a fantasy setting. And I mean, it's clear for a lot of reasons that Ursula K. Le Guin's work influenced Robin Hobb, who's such a great and modern fantasy.
Yeah, I know, and there's so many just powerful moments packed into this short story that I think have rippled into modern fantasy, and
For
or even
sure.
have subverted modern fantasy. When you read it now in 2021, you're like, oh, it's kind of lampooning a lot of these grimdark things that were super popular, and so it's like funny just to
Time is a flat circle.
exactly. And there's this one like little quick moment in Earthsea that I think is kind of appropriate to bring up now, that I really loved in the plot. There was this moment where Ged decides he needs to leave the school, and there's the dude blocking the door.
Yeah,
And he's
I do
like,
love that
you
moment.
you can't get, like, you can leave, but you have to get through me to do it. And he gets thinking about it, and he's thinking
Or it's
about
like,
it.
you need to know my name. Like, you have
Yeah,
to figure out my name.
yeah, you
It's
have to
like, how are
figure
you
out
going to
my
figure it
name.
out?
Exactly, I know. And he's like trying to come up with a strategy, and he's like, maybe I could overtake him. But then he's like, I have one question for you. And he's like, okay, ask it. And he goes, what is your name? And then the doorkeeper smiles and tells him his name and lets him out. It's something that's so profound. It happens so
Oh,
quickly, but it's
yeah.
like, oh, in fantasy, it's always like this question, like, oh, we just assume that it's something he's got to be clever enough to figure out. And it is clever to just ask him. It is. But why would that be clever? Why are we so guarded? Like, this idea of trust, like to ask someone's name is a big deal, to know someone's name is a powerful thing, but he just had to ask, there's some beautiful simplicity, poetry in that moment.
Yeah, and in the world of Earthsea that I've seen so far, I know there's more books. Pretty much it's typically rewarded when you just stop overthinking and you get more in touch with, like, let's just be present in this moment. And this person is saying, you need to know my name. And we can try to almost disassociate from that moment and like be above it and try to come up with some conniving scheme to trick the person into getting their name, or it could be present with another person and just say, okay, what's your name? You said I need to know your name. What's your name? And then they can be present with you and say, here's my name. And those sort of just genuine, just like in the moment interactions are the ones that are valued by, I think, Ursula K. Le Guin in this story.
That's well said. It's it's amazing how much she was able to pack into this. I said that already, but I just rereading it was it was just as rewarding as when I read it the first time. I think I picked up a lot more of the themes this time around, being a bit more of a discerning reader now than I was back then, and I was also listening to it on the audiobook, which it's a really
You were the first time,
the
you're saying,
first
not
time I
this.
was, yeah, and that's a unique way to listen to this. Like, I forget who the narrator was, but he told it in a very like story time way. He was very dramatic with the narration portion as well as the character voices, so it was dramatic the entire time, which I think caused some of the subtlety of it to slip through the cracks for me. So just rereading it was a rewarding experience and cracking into these things. I guess, Dylan, I'm kind of curious, was the shadow having Ged's name this something you hadn't considered up until that point, or was this something you were working towards?
I think I read this in basically 2 sittings, so it wasn't like it's short,
Yeah.
and I didn't follow Logan Ninefinger's advice of once you've got a task to do, better do it than. Not that I was living with the fear of it, but sorry, the full advice is better do it than live with the fear of it. And I procrastinate a little bit with Wizard of Earthsea, and then once I cracked it open, I just started cranking through it. So I think to answer your question, Charles, maybe I was starting to get there, but I didn't. I wasn't like, oh, and then he's gonna say his name, and then the shadow is gonna be like, oh, you got it. It was good the whole time. I wasn't there yet. I think I was. If you gave me some time to sit with it, maybe, because like it made sense when it happened.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, of course, but I wasn't like this will be the ending. So I guess the answer is probably I was working toward it, but I did not know.
Yeah.
How about you, Charles? Do you remember the first time you read it, or this time did you remember that the answer was Ged's name?
I remembered that the answer was Ged's name, but I don't remember like ever figuring out or even thinking to puzzle it out. It's not really presented as a mystery, but the mystery is how is he going to defeat this shadow that has no name, right? That's like the premise, and the answer is, oh, it had a name all along. It was part of him. And reading through it again, there are some like sneaky things. Like 30% of the way into this book, there's a quote, and it goes, it is the shadow of your arrogance, the shadow of your ignorance, the shadow you cast. Has a shadow a name? So they're like, it's like, this is a shadow you cast, and it's of your ignorance. What's the name of it? Like the way they set it up, and right, even in the first third of this book, it's the clues are there. Like you said, it was almost inevitable that it happened, but it happens in such a great way where it's like it's an honest reveal, but it's not one you were like desperately trying to puzzle out or one that you had figured out super early on. It's just this great progression of the story. It's like it can be so hard to land the ending, where so many stories are like, and then he discovered the truth about himself, and in that moment summoned extra courage and power to defeat the bad guy. Where instead it's like he summoned extra courage and power to accept these things about himself and embraced it. Where it's like that's the difference, and that's the Ursula K. Le Guin difference, right? Of just what her priorities are in terms of power and of victory and of conflict. It's not this external battle of 5 armies. It's someone trying to embrace their full selves,
and it makes it so relatable. This is I wish I read this when I'm glad I have read it now, and I wish, although I feel like Ursula K. Le Guin would advise me to just accept things, or would probably let me go through my own crap until I get there myself. And it would have been nice to have read this as a teenager, and it's awesome to have read it now. I think it's just a lot of lessons that would have been really helpful for me as someone who's struggled with hastiness even till today.
I read this book post college, and I agree with you. There's some lessons that I don't know if I would have received them well in my teenage years, but there's certainly lessons I wish I had understood. And here's one where it's because remember, we were at the top of the episode, you were talking about how it was Ged's decision to pursue the shadow, and you were looking at that through the psychology lens of how it like empowered him and caused him to accept some of these things. And I think the quote that summarizes that, and one that I wish I had read maybe earlier in my life than after college, maybe as a teenager, was at last he sought this danger of his own will, and the nearer he came to it, the more sure he was that for this time at least, for this hour perhaps before his death, he was free. And it's that idea of like, I've been living this life afraid and reserved and quiet and defeated, and now that I'm actually doing something about it, I've never felt better, even if maybe it will lead to my ruin. And that's like, hey, like, that's fantastic advice for a teenager who's not sure about who they are and is maybe hesitant to put themselves out there or something like that. It's like the pursuit of it is the empowering thing, and accepting yourself is the empowering thing. And it's like, to me, it's like the quintessential coming of age theme almost.
Yeah, that's well said, Charles. And you're bringing up death now, which is one of the things like you sold me on this story, was that you mentioned existential themes and themes of death in your pitch during Friends Pitching Fantasy. And I kind of latched on to that as
one there on that episode too. I remember.
Yes, a little bit. I gave you an out. I said like. You like, if you can, without spoiling, like, let me know how this gets into existential themes, which you did a phenomenal job of, Charles.
Thank you.
And I think that the other sort of interpretation that was going through my head and about the shadow was thinking about the shadow almost as death. So you could think about, or like the idea of death, that kind of, no matter where we're going, death is looming, right? Like, you cannot escape death. It's part of life, or part of you in a way. It's part of just life, right? There's this quote kind of with it's like, to light a candle is to cast a shadow, and there's some of these quotes around. Yeah, that's a good line, and kind of like, it takes, let's see if I can find the one on silence, because it's like, oh yes, for a word to be spoken, there must be silence before and after, is another quote.
I remember that line.
And that's literally following, that one is following when it's asked, what of death? That's asked by the sister. She has a name, I'm sure, that I'm not getting here, but Vec's sister asked that, I think.
Okay.
That's the. Am I getting these? Vetch is the name. Sorry.
Vetch is the friend.
I'm not getting the. Yes, I'm not getting
I'm happy
the name,
with Vetch.
So, Vetch, yeah, Vetch. Vetch's sister asks, "What of death?" And she's honestly, she's like a very wise character, I think, in a lot of ways that we can get into another point. But that's when Ged says, for word to be spoken, there must be silence before and after. And this is where Ged has more wisdom. It's getting toward the end of the novel. And it's like the shadow is basically this, like, through this interpretation, is basically this idea of death that can haunt you your entire life and keep you from living your life in a way that's actually in line with your values and in line with the things that you want to pursue. You were kind of getting at that, Charles, too, with this, like, accepting yourself and just like being and doing the things you want, those kind of things. And I felt like you could see it as like accepting that moment, like okay, well, if I'm going to exist, I'm going to have a shadow. If I'm going to be alive, I'm going to die. And accepting that is when Ged truly becomes himself and is able to then go on and live his life. And I thought that was really, like, a really powerful way to think about it.
Yeah, no, I agree totally. There's so many great moments in those scenes with Vetch's sister, who I'm trying to find the name of, and with Ged, and they have all these great talks where she's like, explain to me magic, come on, you, like, let me let me in on some of these ideas. And then gets trying to explain like, oh, I could summon a meat pie and I could taste it and it could even be filling, but it remains a word and it fools the stomach and gives no strength to the hungry man. Oh, and her name is Muir, I believe. And she goes, wizards then are not cooks, which is I thought was just kind of a funny moment. And it comes back to this idea of like, yeah, it's all the power in the world. Like, it's not gonna feel it, it's you're not a cook at the end of the day, I thought that was kind of funny, like to kind of think of those moments, and it's like, yeah, there's kind of wisdom in saying that too.
Yeah, well, I think that the way that I think of her as a character, and can you say her name again?
Murre. I'm gonna call it
Muir.
Muir. Yeah.
Sure. So Muir as a character, she's compared to.
Oh boy, I'm gonna get in trouble.
That sounds more
Muir
accurate.
and there's Yarrow. There's two characters. So Yarrow.
Yarrow sounds more accurate.
Is the sister.
Yeah. Okay.
Mm.
Say that one more time, Charles. Yarrow.
Yep. Yarrow.
Okay. So then Yarrow is compared, like, her actual true name, which is a whole nother concept in here, it translates to minnow. And at one point it said, she is like a little fish, a minnow that swims in a clear creek, he said, defenseless, yet you cannot catch her. And I was thinking of this idea of the clear creek and her being compared to a minnow or an animal as being in line with this way that the animals have a lot more wisdom than do the people in Wizard of Earthsea, like we were talking about before. And the clear creek, meaning that she can see through clearly. She can see through.
She's very
what's
wise,
actually going
but
on.
this minnow is not a powerful creature, but it's an understanding one, and one that equilibrium with their place in the world. So it's like, oh, minnow in a clear creek is an animal that is in its environment and is fully understanding of their place in it. And then the minnow is kind of just like, oh, she's not a mage, she's not this all-powerful mage, but she is wise. And I believe that's the kind of the invite, the comparison that this minnow metaphor is inviting.
Yeah, I completely agree. And she's called wise explicitly in the text. Mm-hmm. There's the thought of her brought to his mind the sense of her wise and childish sweetness. And there's that piece too, which is almost, there's a wisdom in a child just being a child that almost like Ged didn't have in his childhood. Ged was always trying to pump himself up when he was a kid, try to be more than he was, and have all of this power that he didn't really have. He was he was a shepherd from the River R. A lot of sheep herders from rivers in fantasy novels, but this sheep herder, unlike Rand from the Wheel of Time,
for a while.
was actually. And probably
That's
actually
say,
looks
right?
No. So this sheep herder is like Rand is early on in Wheel of Time. It's not spoilers to say Rand is characterized by his reluctance. That's like part of why Robert Jordan wrote the Wheel of Time, was wanting to write this like reluctant hero character. And Ged growing up is the opposite. He is a shepherd from a place with river in the name, and he wants to be more. He wants to be powerful. He wants to impress everyone and show him how great he is. And there's these awesome lines that really resonated for me. Like, you knew me when I was a kid, Charles. Like, as a kid that struggled with a lot of this stuff too, of like, when you're not sure what someone is saying, you don't understand. Which is a big part of this story is like understanding, then you don't fear. When you don't understand and you're insecure, you replace that with like, this person has to be mocking me. And that happens all the time to Ged early on. Is like, he because he's so insecure and not accepting of himself as a child who doesn't have power yet, he's constantly like going out of his way to try to wield power and causing issues in his life and issues for those around him.
Yeah, and Jasper, his rival at school, is presented as someone who was from maybe a more wealthy family or noble family or something like that, and there was these like classist jokes, and he called him like a sheep herder or something like that, and a shepherder or something like that, a goater, I think it was.
Which Rand would have been like, thank you.
Yeah, he's like, that's what I've been saying this whole time. But Get is like, what? Like, I'll test your merit against mine any day. And that's what like brings the Shadow into the school and kind of kicks off a lot of the issues here. Was we see the Shadow for the first time when Get is trying to impress somebody when he's a child, and then now at the school it comes back and attacks him when he's actually trying to show off against Jasper. So yeah, I mean, there's the obvious parallel that the Shadow is born from all of these insecurities and all of this fronting of being competitive and trying to use power to like defeat someone else or humiliate someone else or be better than someone else. That's just not how the world works. So when you go against the nature of how the world works and how the energy of the world works, you're gonna cause this shadowy disruption to form. So basically is where the story's going.
If if Ged was just like, yeah, I grew up a sheep herder, like, and now I'm in a wizard school. That is the reality. I accept those things. Then,
this would have been a much
less interesting story. But it would have been easier on. There would have been a lot less conflict for Ged, but he had to go through the process of learning that was like, by the end of it, Ged, he'd probably be pretty willing to say, yes, I grew up as a shepherd.
Yeah, and this is the quote at the very end of the book that I think summarizes that, where Geddes goes, and he began to see the truth, that Ged had neither lost nor won, but, naming the shadow of his death with his own name, had made himself whole, a man who, knowing his whole true self, cannot be used or possessed by any power other than himself, and whose life, therefore, is lived for life's sake. If he had known that lesson when he was dealing with Jasper, it's like, I know that I was a shepherd, and like that's cool. It's like, I'm down with that. But this idea of having to learn that lesson, and that's ultimately the lesson that he takes away from this.
That's so true, Charles. That makes me think about what we were talking about earlier too, with the like acceptance of death or trauma or just this darker side of your personality toward the greater pursuit of like, well, once you've said like all that's just the case and I accept it, then that's when the living starts. That's when you can just go about your life and try to be present with it and enjoy it for what it is.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of, I'm not going to spoil Game of Thrones, but there's a famous line by Tyrion where he's like, take what they say
that's in like
and make it a shield so they can't use it against you. Like, own it and make it a part of yourself, right? So it's like, oh, like, people are making fun of you for being a bastard son. Just accept that you're a bastard, and then it'll
wear it like armor.
Wear it like armor. Yes, thank you. I was just talking about shields. Wear it like armor, and it can't be used against you. And so it parallels that really well. It's that same lesson of self-acceptance.
I've got the quote.
Oh, great.
From Tyrion, and this is in the first episode of the Game of Thrones show. Just in case,
it's not a spoiler. If anything, it's a reason to watch it and read the books.
For sure. Tyrion. I think this is from the show quote because it's a little different in the books, but it's one of them. Never forget what you are. The rest of the world will not. Wear it like armor, and it can never be used to hurt you. And I think that is the kind of advice that would have made a lot of sense for Ged to hear, like you're talking about, Charles, where it's like, you are nervous about being like from these humble beginnings of being a shepherd, and like you don't want people to treat you in that way. Well, guess what? If they can only do that to you insofar as you are insecure about the fact that you are a shepherd, like you were a shepherd from the River R, and now you're in a magic school.
Yeah, exactly. Like it says,
they can't hurt you if you accept that.
It cannot be used or possessed by any power other than himself. Or it's like, okay, you know who you are, you know your whole self, good and bad. And bad, I'm doing air quotes because it's not necessarily evil. It's just this other side of you, and you accept those things about yourself, and that doesn't. So therefore, other people don't have power over you. You don't have a Jasper character goading you into a duel,
They can't
right?
goad
They
you.
can't. Yeah, exactly. So
What are they going to do to goad you if you
that's
accept all the
power
things?
that's being like fantasticized into this like literal power. But it's this idea that, hey, if you weren't insecure about being a shepherd and being younger than Jasper and having less life experience than Jasper, you wouldn't have challenged him to a duel and summoned the shadow, and the shadow wouldn't have had to be banished by the archmage, who then would have died. And you would have,
Right.
and now you're all scarred up and stuff like that. It's like it stems from a very honest human experience, which is part of growing up, which is what makes this a great coming of age tale.
I totally agree, Charles. And dude, there's so much to talk about. I feel like there's so much depth to. Oh, and how could we not? I want to make sure we give a shout out to Wise Fool, who has been. I mean, I wish we did that at the top of the show because, Wise Fool has been championing this book and wanting us to. That's one of our listeners and buddies on the social media platforms who has been listening since like our first episode. And one of the first exchanges we ever had with a listener, Charles, was like Wise Fool telling us
to read Earthsea.
to read A Wizard of Earthsea. Before all the other stuff that now everyone wants us to read, it was A Wizard of Earthsea and Wise Fool telling us, and I think
it was his comments that made me like, you know what? That's something that I'll consider next time we go into Friends Pitching Fantasy, because you made me think of Earthsea in another way, and it was the way he was able to describe it. I was like, this is actually a great book to pitch to Dylan for a whole lot of ways. I think it was we did a King Killer recommendations episode, and he was like, Earthsea people, I've been saying, like, hello.
Yes.
And so I was like,
makes so much sense
and
now.
I was like, I never thought to compare Earthsea to King Killer, and I had read both, and it just never came up for me. And then he said it, and it was like a whole series of thoughts clicked in my brain, and I was like, I'm pitching this next Friends Pitching Fantasy, and I'm going to sell it to Dylan, and we'll see if he goes for it. And
I forgot that Wise Fool brought it up in the context of a King Killer recommendation, and that's how Robin Hobb got involved.
Yeah, that's how Robin Hobb.
Was saying,
because I came in to reply to Wise Fool, being like, "Hey, there's all these comparisons," and then Robin Hobb liked it, and now we're here.
It's like, that's so interesting, and that was such a great context for Wise Fool to bring it up, because that was exactly what was going through my head constantly throughout this series. I was thinking about King Killer Chronicle more than any other series.
Oh yeah, definitely.
While reading this,
definitely.
It makes so much sense. So thank you to Wise Fool for like putting us down a path that eventually got us here. I don't know. It's been a journey, not unlike Ged's to get here. So thanks, Wise Fool.
Yes, thank you, Wise Fool. It's true, and I'm really glad that you liked it. I'm glad I've been able to turn you on to a lot of older fantasy, and I had a feeling that I knew your subjective tastes enough that this was gonna scratch an itch for you, and it seems like it went beyond that. So that's super exciting, and I'm excited to read All Systems Red, which I cracked the cover. I'm like 10% in, and it's already like, whereas this book takes itself very, very seriously, All Systems Red seems to be a bit more satirical and humorous, so it's funny to read them back to back, and I'm just looking forward to it, is all I'm saying. It's gonna be a lot of fun.
I mean, this is what we do on Friends Talking, especially when we do back-to-back pitched books from me and you. It's like, or from you and me in this case, we'll do this classic, like, it feels very, it's like just very influential, classic work from the 1960s of fantasy that set off so many things, all the way now to a very, very modern sci-fi book in the Murderbot's Diaries and All Systems Red. So, we're covering the gambit with these two. And yeah, I'm pumped. It's been awesome. I really didn't know I would enjoy Wizard of Earthsea this much. So
That's great.
Yeah, I appreciate you pitching it and bringing it in here, Charles.
Yeah, well, there's many other books in the series. There's many scenes that we didn't even get to discuss, like the scene where he's marooned on the island with the two siblings, and like all these other things that we can go back and talk about later on that are just kind of interesting little thought pieces to get into. There's movies. I think I said that, but I think there's like a Miyazaki film, that
really
an animated film of Earthsea that we could potentially watch and discuss. Ursula's gone on record being like they missed the point, but we can watch that and decide for ourselves. She seemed like a tough critic, and I think she understands the story at a much higher level than I can see some of the themes being
find myself thinking that if she said that, I find myself thinking she's probably accurate, but I'll try to go in with an open mind if we do that.
So there's options, and we'll see if people are interested in hearing us talk more about Earthsea. We will happily deliver because there's so much more we can sink our teeth into in this.
No, I have several ideas for episodes on A Wizard of Earthsea, so we'll take a look at the reaction here. Definitely, we always take a look at the download numbers and things like that, but also like the reaction on social media and stuff. So if you do want, I have a few ideas. If you do want to hear us do more episodes on Wizard of Earthsea, let us know. Charles will definitely let you know which places you can do that when we.
That's right.
Yeah, we close out the show.
Yeah, which will be soon because we have been indoctrinated into the wise fool Earthsea school of just enthusiasm. So we're ready to talk more about it. It's just
for sure.
For now, though, I'm really happy with where we are in the discussion, and I had. A book like this is just so much fun to talk about in like a book club buddy read format because there's just so many. First of all, it's a shorter read, but there's so many deep themes and imagery and metaphors in here that we can talk about, and it's a particularly fun one to talk about, and I'm glad that we were able to talk about it together, Dylan, because it's fun. It's been so much fun bouncing some of these theories
and like I guess like it is fun, like because I'm enjoying myself and having fun, but I guess it's like that almost sells it short to just call it fun because it's like it's so freaking deep. Yeah, it's like deep. There's so many like deep philosophical, psychological, spiritual even themes to this to sink your teeth into, and I hope we did some justice of trying to sink our teeth into it today, and I'd love to sink our teeth into it more in the future. So,
I agree.
Yeah, it's awesome talking about this with you, Charles, and
likewise, Dylan. And I think if we're happy with where the conversation's at, we can go ahead and play that sweet, sweet outro music.
Sounds like a plan, Charles. Let's get that sweet, sweet outro music pumping.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for listening to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. If you like what you heard today, and if you want to hear more Earthsea, guys, let us know, because
we're practically begging.
We basically only need just the smallest bit of validation of like, that was okay, and they'll be like, yeah, okay, we're doing more. So just let us know over on Twitter. Yes, let us. Yeah, exactly. We're delusional enough that we'll take even the smallest crumb here, and that's over at the FTF Podcast with a number 1 at the end, and we're also on Facebook and Instagram at the FTF Podcast. You can always send us an email at the ftfpodcast@gmail.com. And Dylan, if they wanted to support the show even further and they're listening on Apple Podcasts, what can they do?
Toss 5 stars to our podcast. Just find that Friends Talking Fantasy page on the Apple Podcast app, and then scroll past all those episodes that you're seeing until you start seeing stars. Once you're seeing stars, the optimal number of stars to click to support the show would be 5 of those stars. If you have a little bit of extra time and you want to write a review, that's even more helpful for getting people to find the show, and we would really appreciate that. Yep. But just listening is more than enough. Thank you so much for doing that.
thank you everybody for listening all the way to the end. You guys are awesome. We greatly appreciate you. And as always, go forth and conquer, friends.